Hi everyone, welcome back to Political Theory and the Constitution. This will be part 2 of this topic. To begin with, we are going to pick up and talk about the branches of government. Remember, going back to part 1, this is what Montesquieu was talking about when it came time to starting our government, right? One of those theories was that our government should be broken up into different institutions. In this case, the U.S. government is broken up into 3 branches. Now, please make note. This is very important. If I tell you it's important, chances are good it is going to be on an exam. The branches of government will align with the first 3 articles of the Constitution, okay? So make note. The legislative branch is the first branch of government. It is found in Article 1 of the Constitution. So Article 1 establishes Congress. Congress, of course, is made up of 2 houses, and this is how we learn about the election of our representatives. Article 1 not only establishes Congress, but it establishes the means of election for representatives and for senators. Article 1 also enumerates. Learn the word enumerates. E-N-U-M-E-R-A-T-E-S. It enumerates the powers of Congress. In other words, it lists what powers Congress has. Now, an important part of Article 1 is the necessary and proper clause. Okay, so the necessary and proper clause is also known as the elastics clause. The elastics clause, or the necessary and proper clause, acts as a vehicle to expand legislative power beyond those actions that are specifically mentioned in the text of the Constitution. Traditionally, the courts have let Congress use the elastic clause to increase and expand their power. And we will touch on this a little bit later, and you'll hear me say this a lot because of the way this course is set up. Everything that we speak about in the beginning of this course of this semester will be a building block for the rest of the topics. Now, the executive branch, Article 2. So legislative branch is Article 1, the executive branch is Article 2. Now, Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the executive branch. In other words, it establishes the presidency. Now, the framers wanted an energetic executive to be capable of timely action to deal with public problems. Remember back to the Shays Rebellion. At the time, we had a weak central government, so there was no president at the time that could do anything, right? There was no central government leadership that was willing to deal with public problems. Now, the framers also wanted a moderately independent executive who would be able to respond to crisis and would be insulated from direct voter election, right? So that's where the Electoral College comes in. It created an indirect system of election through the Electoral College. Now, the president is granted the power to recognize other countries, negotiate treaties, although the acceptance of any treaties that the president makes do require the 2/3 vote of approval by the Senate. The president also is able to grant reprieves and pardons, and the president can convene Congress in special sessions. And of course, the president's biggest power is his ability to veto congressional enactments. In other words, the president can veto Congress's laws. And of course, the third branch is the judicial branch. Judicial branch, Article 3. Now, the judicial branch is a check on too much democracy. So Article 3 of the Constitution creates this judicial branch. According to Article 3, the Supreme Court justices are appointed for life terms by the President with the approval of the Senate. Lifetime tenure and is what Article 3 grants the justices. It also protects their pay, and we will go into more detail as to why there is a protection and lifetime appointment for the Supreme Court justices, for federal judges in general. Now, the Supreme Court's power specifically includes resolving conflicts between federal and state laws, determining whether power belongs to the national government or the states, and settling controversies between citizens of different states. The Constitution makes no direct mention of one power eventually assumed by the Supreme Court, judicial review. Now, judicial review, contrary to popular belief, is not found in the Constitution. It is the power of the courts to declare actions of the legislative and executive branches invalid or unconstitutional. And we'll talk about judicial review with more detail during the judicial part of the semester. But please learn and know the order of the branches, the order that they were created in. So the legislative branch is Article 1, the executive branch is Article 2, and the judicial branch is Article 3. And when we speak of the judicial branch as part of the Constitution, we are talking about specifically the Supreme Court. We will speak about the federal courts in general later on the semester, but for now, the judicial branch in this case is the Supreme Court, and it is Article 3. Now we'll touch on federalism a little bit more, and we talked about it as one of those broad powers of the Constitution. Now, federalism, we are talking about national unity and power. So the federalism part of the Constitution is what sets this apart from the Articles of Confederation, where the states competed against each other. Now, Article 4 establishes reciprocity between the states. That means that each state must give full faith and credit to the official acts of other states and guarantee the citizens of any state the privileges and immunities of every other state. What this means is that what is legal in one state has to remain legal in another state. Prior to 2015, when same-sex marriage became legal nationwide, certain states allowed same-sex marriages to happen. New York was one of those states. So if two persons of the same sex married in New York under New York law, which guaranteed same-sex marriage legality, then if they were to move to Texas or any other state that did not have that same law, their marriage would still remain legal and they would continue to be seen as a married couple. That is what we mean by privileges and immunities and full faith and credit. So what is legal in one state, such as same-sex marriage was in certain states before 2015, had to be legal in other states, right? Each state had to recognize the other state's official acts. Now, Article 4 institutes national supremacy with the Supremacy Clause. This clause states that laws passed by the national government and all treaties are the supreme law of the land. So Article 4, or excuse me, I said Article 4. I meant Article 6. Excuse me, that was my mistake. So Article 6 institutes national supremacy clause. Like I started to say, it states that the laws passed by the national government and all treaties are the supreme law of the land and superior to all laws adopted by any state or subdivision. Basically, any law that is passed by the federal government by Congress and signed by the President supersedes any state law. It also, federalism, right, also establishes a process, right, for how to amend the Constitution. Now, the Constitution has a total of 27 amendments. Amending the Constitution is no easy task, okay? Proposals must be put forth by 2/3 of both chambers of Congress or a convention called by 2/3 of the state legislatures. Amendments must then be ratified by either the legislatures or state conventions of 3/4 of the states. And we'll touch more on the amendment process. It is a very detailed process to go through. Now, from amending, we have to go to ratification. We are also looking at this being set forth in Article 7. Article 7 sets forth the ratification rules. And at this point, 9 of the 13 states, remember we only had 13 states to begin with, would have to ratify the Constitution. Of course, since then, that number has changed. Now, the Constitution limits the national government's power. That is the whole point of the Constitution, right? Is to set out the limits and the powers that are allowed to the federal government. Now, the framers wanted to create a powerful national government with safeguards against misuse of that power. To do so, the framers included 3 limitations in the Constitution: separation of powers, federalism, and the Bill of Rights. Now, with separation of powers, this is the principle that indicates that power must be used to balance power. Under this principle, the entire structure of the national government is built upon 3 separate branches: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Checks and balances were the method to maintain the separation of the 3 branches. However, this method not only gave each branch its own powers, but also gave each branch some powers over the other branches. And I will refer you back to the infographic that I have online for you. Please check the chart or the graphic that I have on separation of powers and on checks and balances. Do not get the 2 of them confused. Now, federalism. The delegates devised a system of 2 sovereign powers, the states and the nation. Remember, federalism is just the system of separating government between the federal and the states. This they did with the hope that this would limit the powers of both the state and the federal government, where the states do not have a stronger hold over the federal government, and the federal government does not hold a clear controlling action over the states. Lastly, the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights consists of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and these 10 amendments were adopted shortly after the ratification of the Constitution. It was with the intent to limit national power and to protect the citizens. And we will talk about the amendments at the end of the semester, but this is the point in the Constitution where we are talking about individual protection for the people. Now, online, along with the other resources that I have provided, I have included a list of the constitutional articles and amendments for you to have as a cheat sheet or a shortcut. It is quick and easy to look at, and so you can differentiate between the articles and the amendments. Know the amendments, know the articles. They will come up in exams further on down the semester. And in the first exam, you will have questions about those amendments or about those articles. Excuse me. Now on to ratification, since we were just talking about the amendments. Now, of course, ratification was the first hurdle that the Constitution faced. Remember, we had just come out of a revolution. We had to build our government. We wrote the Articles of Confederation. And then shortly thereafter, we had to convince the people that we had to rewrite the Constitution. In all honesty, we were rewriting our government, right? So the fight involved two sides, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists were those framers that favored strong national government and supported the proposed American Constitution at the 1787 convention. Now, during the ratification process, thousands of essays, speeches, pamphlets, and letters were presented in support of the Constitution. Now, remember, they went into this convention with the intent to revise, not rewrite. And now they are having to convince the people that it's a good idea to scrap what we had just built and start over. Well, in order to do that, they used these essays and speeches and pamphlets and letters to convince people that what they were doing was the right thing to do. So, this group called the Federalists, now where did we hear the names of these pamphlets, right? The Federalists are the ones who wrote the Federalist Papers, right? There are Federalists number 1 through 76, 80, something like that. I don't remember right offhand. Now, the best constitutional support pieces are, of course, those that are known as the Federalist Papers. They are, of course, a series of short essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. The three of them used these essays in order to support the Constitution, a new rewritten Constitution, right? So the three of them wrote essays and these pamphlets, and they tried to convince the people that they should support the new Constitution. Well, there's two sides to every story, and of course there were anti-federalists. Now, the anti-federalists favored strong state governments and a weaker national government, the concern being that we would be back under the type of rule that we had when we were a British colony. We are trying to stay away from that monarch, king, very strong central government that would be concerned only for the central government and not the people, right? So the anti-federalists also wrote papers in opposition to the new Constitution, and their lead writer was Robert Yates. Well, in the end, what's the difference between the two sides, right? Why are they fighting with each other? Why can't they come to some sort of understanding? Well, the difference between the two sides came down to representation. This was one of the major controversies, right? The anti-federalists asserted that representation must be a true picture of the people and favored more direct democracy, which would not be possible to obtain in such a large nation. The Federalists, on the other hand, felt it was not necessary for representatives to be exactly like those they represented. They asserted that the advantage of a representative government over a direct democracy was the ability to choose representatives with superior qualifications to those possessed by the people. Though discussion terms have changed, the representation debate continues today, right? We are still fighting this representation battle. And it comes up every year during election time. But for this purpose, just know that representation was one of the big controversies between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, another difference was tyranny of the majority. Now, this issue stems from the Anti-Federalist point of view that danger rested on the ability of the few to tyrannize the many. The Anti-Federalists feared the concentration of power in the hands of a small governing elite. The Federalists, on the other hand, recognized the nature not in aristocracy, but in tyranny by the majority, the tendency of majorities to trample on the rights and interests of other citizens. So stop for a minute and think about the way they are talking about tyranny of the majority here. The Anti-Federalists' point of view was that there was danger in the ability of the few to tyrannize the many, right? But they were talking about the few governing elite. Now, the Federalists were concerned with tyranny by the majority, but in this case, they were talking about the majority meaning any trampling on the rights and interests of other citizens, that there would be a majority of groups or a majority of interests that would come together and trample on the rights and interests of those with a minority or an opposing view. Next, we have governing or governmental power. This issue was a concern for both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, both sides agreed on the principle of limited government. This would be a government whose powers are defined and limited by a constitution. Okay, they agreed on that point. However, they differed on how to place limits on this governmental power. The Anti-Federalists wanted to enumerate the national powers in relation to the states and the people. Okay, and the Federalists were, of course, of the opposing view. Now, what we see in the Constitution is national powers are listed in relation to what the federal government can do. We do not have a clear-cut view of what powers are left to the state. All we know is what powers are given to the federal government, okay? And what powers do the people have? Well, it's not listed in the Constitution, and we'll touch on this later on as we go over each individual branch of the government. Now, both sides helped and contributed to the writing and the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. It was largely the Federalist point of view that triumphed, though. However, the Anti-Federalists' criticism forced the adoption of a Bill of Rights. Now remember, the original Constitution in the actual articles did not list the rights of the people. But what did I say about the Bill of Rights? Those are the laws that apply to the people, right? So it was the Anti-Federalists that forced the adoption of the Bill of Rights to limit national governmental power. This arrangement proved effective for over 200 years, even as the political principles enshrined in the Constitution have benefited groups and interests unforeseen by the framers. Stop and consider, over 200 years ago, these framers, this small group of men, came together to create a new nation and build a government that by all intent and purposes was an experiment, right? Everywhere else, there was no government such as this. So it is because of these two sides that we have the Constitution and the government that we have today. Was it perfect? No, by no means was it perfect. No government is perfect. However, it seems, even though with the issues that we have, to be a better institution than many that we see around the world. And we'll touch on all of these types of issues as we go. Like I said before, be sure you write down your comments and any questions and bring them up as we have discussions or as we have a chance to interact more throughout the semester. Now we'll touch a little bit on the constitutional amendments. Now, the Constitution has survived for over 200 years, but with changes, of course. It is these changes that are called the amendments. So how do we amend, right? The amendments are the changes that are added to a bill or to a law, but in this instance to the Constitution. There are two ways of amending. Now, the first one is passage in the House and Senate. An amendment has to pass both chambers of Congress, each by a 2/3 vote. It is then followed by majority ratification by 3/4 of the state's legislatures. Now, the second way is also passage in the House and Senate, each by 2/3 vote, followed by ratification by 3/4 of the state's conventions. So it can either be the state's legislatures or the states can hold conventions to pass the amendments. Now, amendments reflect higher law. What this means is that you have to consider that most efforts to amend the Constitution have failed. Many of these failed attempts have been efforts to implement societal policy, right? These are views changes. We're changing views. We're trying to change views via amendments instead of legislation. For example, efforts to ban school busing. Now, successful amendments have generally involved the structure and composition of government. This would be the rules of presidential succession, expanding those who are franchised, meaning the right to vote. These are mechanical changes, right? Not societal changes. These are not view changes. These are mechanical changes. So this is consistent with the notion that the Constitution is higher law, and it is a framework within which laws and policies are made. So it is actually easier to change policy than to amend the Constitution. So keep in mind that the Constitution was not meant as a way to change people's views, right? We are changing, we are doing mechanical changes, such as giving more people the right to vote. Now, take all of this into consideration. This is a quick view on the Constitution. This is basically the bare bones of how the U.S. Constitution that we have today came to be and why it is still in effect. As I noted, it is very difficult to make constitutional amendments, which is why we are stuck at 27, right? So this is where the theoretical part of the Constitution and the initial foray into the Constitution ends. Our next topic will be federalism, I believe, and then we have Congress. So if you have any questions, email me. Otherwise, I will be back with our next topic. Thanks. Until then.